I set my leather folder on the hall table the same way I had every night for 14 years. The spine was worn smooth from the same motion, the same spot, the same hand. I noticed that for the first time that night. Funny what you notice. Carol was at the kitchen table with a glass of Merlot and the posture of someone who had been sitting there for a while, working up to something. She did not ask how my day was. She did not offer me dinner. She just looked at me with this expression I couldn't quite name, somewhere between determined and relieved. "I've been seeing someone," she said. No preamble, no apology. Like she was telling me the dishwasher was broken. I put my keys on the counter. "How long?" "That's not the point." "It's a point." She set her wine glass down. "Ray, I found someone who makes triple your salary and actually looks good. I'm done pretending this is enough." I looked at her for a second, and then I said, "Congratulations." She stared at me, waiting. I think she expected me to knock something over or cry or start bargaining. When none of that happened, she filled the silence herself. "That's it? That's all you've got?" "God, Ray, this is exactly why." "When did it start?" she told me. I nodded. I picked up my leather folder and walked to my office. "You're pathetic. You know that? Pathetic." "Okay, Carol." I closed the office door. I sat at my desk. I want to be honest about what happened in those next 4 minutes, because I think people expect a man to either go cold or go to pieces, and I didn't either. I felt it, the whole weight of it. 14 years of a marriage ending in about 45 seconds of kitchen conversation. It sat right behind my sternum like a stone. My hand went to the edge of the desk. My vision went a little gray at the edges. I took one long breath through my nose, and I sat there and I let it be what it was. Then I pulled out a legal pad and started writing. Date. Time. Her exact words. My exact words. I wrote for 20 minutes. When I was done, I sealed the pages in an envelope and wrote Dave Kowalski's name on the front. Upstairs, I heard Megan's door close. She'd heard. Of course she'd heard. I went to the foot of the stairs. "Megan, you okay?" A pause. "No, me neither. We'll talk tomorrow." I went back to the kitchen. Carol was still at the table, refilling her wine. I didn't look at her. I went to the mail pile on the counter and found the Amex statement. I photographed every page with my phone, front and back, then emailed the files to myself. I did it without rushing. I did it the same way I do everything. One step at a time, no wasted motion. Then, I walked out to my truck. The late September air was still warm. A dog was barking somewhere down the block. I cracked the window and sat in the dark, and I thought about what I actually knew and what I still needed to find out. Those are different categories. I have always been careful about keeping them separate. I sat there maybe 15 minutes. The neighborhood was quiet except for that dog. I had 14 years of client contacts in that leather folder on the passenger seat, and Carol had just told me I was nothing. I thought about that for a minute. Then I thought about what I actually knew about my own finances, my own accounts, my own reputation in this town. I started the truck and drove to a Kinko's that was open until midnight. I had a letter to copy before morning. The next morning, I was in my office at 6:45. Black coffee, the Amex photos printed out and spread across my standing desk. I worked through them methodically. Hotel names, dates, florist charges. A weekend in Savannah that Carol had told me was a benefits conference. I found not one pattern, two. Different hotels, different cities, different billing cycles. I circled each cluster with a red pen. I was not angry. I was thorough. "She wasn't careful," I said out loud, to no one. "She was just counting on me not to look." I photographed the circled pages and emailed the second set to Dave Kowalski. Subject line, "For the file." Then, I walked downstairs to Marcus Webb's office. Marcus owns the title company on the ground floor of our building. We've shared a wall for 11 years. He took one look at me when I came through his door and closed his laptop. "How bad?" "Two of them, at least." "Son of a bitch." "Yeah." He went to his bottom drawer and produced 2 bottles of Yuengling. It was 7:15 in the morning. He set one in front of me without asking. We drank without talking for a while, which is one of the things I appreciate about Marcus. He doesn't feel the need to fill silence. Then he said, deadpan, you know what the worst part is? I always thought she was kind of a pain in the ass anyway. I laughed. A real laugh, short and sharp, surprised right out of me. It was the first real laugh in 24 hours, and it didn't fix anything, but it made me feel human again, which was something. Thanks, Marcus. Don't mention it, seriously. I drove to Dave Kowalski's office. Dave has been doing family law in Clarksburg for 22 years. He's the least dramatic man I've ever met, which is exactly what you want in an attorney. He had already read my email. He had a yellow legal pad in front of him with 3 columns written in his small, precise handwriting. You want to know what you're worth, he said, or you want to feel bad first? Skip the second part. He laid it out. The silent equity stake in Allegheny Placement Partners that I had structured 4 years ago, a placement firm I co-founded with a partner in Pittsburgh, kept out of our joint finances because it was a business asset, not a personal one. The portfolio account at Edward Jones held in the business name. The placement fee income for the last 3 years, which ran significantly north of what Carol thought I earned. She thinks you make, what, 60? 70? She stopped asking about 8 years ago. Dave looked at me over his reading glasses. Ray, you're not the lesser earner. I know. I don't think you understand what I mean. You haven't been the lesser earner for a long time. I absorbed that without satisfaction. I already knew. I just needed it documented. I asked Dave to begin the separation filing immediately and to flag the Amex documentation as evidence of marital waste. He said he'd have the paperwork drafted by end of week. He said it the way he says everything, quietly, like it was already done. I drove back to Maple Fork Road to pack. 1 bag, work clothes, laptop, the leather folder. I moved through the house without sentiment. I'd lived there for 11 years, and I knew every creak in the floor and every draft from the windows, and none of it felt like mine anymore. That's a strange thing to discover, that a house you've paid for can stop feeling like yours in about 12 hours. I was in the bedroom when I found it, a framed photo on Carol's nightstand, the kind of thing you miss when it's been there long enough to become furniture. It was labeled on the back. I'd never looked before. Allegheny Federal Solutions Gala March. Carol and a man I didn't recognize. I recognized him now. I'd looked him up the night before. Dennis Colby, finance director at Allegheny Federal Morgantown. 47 years old. Looked like a man who spent money on his haircuts and thought that made him interesting. I set the frame face down on the nightstand. I did not smash it. I just set it face down and walked out of the room. The deliberate restraint of that felt like something. I'm not sure what. Megan was on the stairs, watching me. Where are you going? Somewhere I can think. I'll call you tonight. Dad, I love you, Megan. This isn't about you. I know whose fault it is. She said it flat and clear, the way she says things when she means them completely. She's 17 and she has her mother's temper and my habit of watching before she speaks. And right then, she was all the way on my side. I didn't want her to be. I wanted her to be a kid who didn't have to pick sides. But she'd already decided, and I wasn't going to insult her by pretending otherwise. I left the house key on the counter. I did not look at Carol, who was standing in the kitchen doorway. I walked out, went around to the backyard, and got Hank. He's a 7-year-old black lab mix, about 75 pounds. And he looked up at me with the uncomplicated loyalty of a dog who doesn't need an explanation. He just fell in to step beside me and got in the truck. The October air had turned overnight. There was a first frostbite to it that wasn't there last week. I found a furnished apartment near Fort Caldwell by noon and paid the deposit in cash. The apartment smelled like burnt coffee and someone else's cleaning products. Hank sniffed every corner and then sat down next to me like he'd decided it was fine. I set the leather folder on the kitchen counter and opened my laptop. I had 12 calls to return and a whiteboard to update. Carol thought she knew what I was worth. She'd been counting on a number she invented 8 years ago. That was her first mistake. The second one was calling me pathetic to my face. I don't get loud when I'm angry. I get organized. And I was about to get very organized. First morning in the apartment, 6 a.m. Hank was already at the door. I made coffee with the machine that came with the place. It produced something that smelled burnt before it was even done. Cold tile under bare feet. I stood at the window and looked at the parking lot and the gray November sky and built a list in my head. A knock at the door. I opened it to find a woman I'd never seen before, holding a French press and a mug. She was maybe 49, dark hair pulled back, paint on her forearms that she hadn't quite scrubbed off. I heard someone move in last night, she said. I figured the machine in there is terrible. It is. I'm June. I'm not going to ask questions. Ray, I appreciate that. She handed me the French press and the mug and left. She did not linger. She did not look at Hank with the exaggerated enthusiasm some people use as a way to start conversations. She just handed me the coffee and went back down the hall. I noted that she'd asked for nothing and explained nothing. I noted that mattered to me more than I expected. I drove out to the Burnsville Lake Trail that morning. Early, empty. The water was flat and gray, and there was nobody around to perform anything for. Hank ran the gravel path ahead of me, nose down, chasing something invisible. I walked for 40 minutes and thought about what I knew, what I could prove, and what I wanted. I kept those three categories separate because they are always separate, even when they feel like the same thing. I did not want Dennis Colby destroyed. I want to be clear about that. I wanted Dennis Colby to stop being a problem. Those are different things, and the difference matters. About 20 minutes in, I stopped walking. I'd been building a mental file on Dennis for 3 days, and somewhere in that file was something I hadn't let myself look at directly. I had enough, through my network, through 12 years of placing people in the Fort Caldwell Federal Contractor Corridor, to trigger a security clearance review on Dennis Colby that would end his career permanently. I had the name of a former colleague who documented irregularities in Dennis's expense reporting at a previous firm. I had a reference who described Dennis's management of federal contract budgets as creative. I had enough. I stood at the water's edge. Hank came back and sat next to me. Am I doing this because it's right? I said out loud. Or because I'm angry? Hank did not have an opinion. The water was flat and gray, and it didn't have one either. I stood there long enough for the cold to work through my jacket. Then I decided the job reference was proportionate. The clearance file stayed in the drawer. I was going to do this clean, or I wasn't going to do it. I walked back to the truck. Back in my office, I updated the whiteboard. 43 placements over 12 years. Every name in blue marker, every current position noted. I circled Walt Pruitt's name. Walt is the chair of the Fort Caldwell Civilian Hiring Board, a retired Army colonel who speaks in complete sentences and expects the same in return. I've known him for 8 years. I picked up the phone. Walt, it's Ray Denton. Ray, heard you moved out this way. I did. I wanted you to know I'm local now. And I wanted to ask you something about the comptroller search. I was going to call you about that anyway. We've got a candidate we're not sure about. Tell me the name. A beat. Just a beat. Dennis Colby. I wrote the name on the whiteboard. I already knew. I just needed Walt to say it first. I told Walt I had professional history with Dennis Colby and could provide a confidential reference. Walt said he'd be grateful. I said I'd have something in writing by end of week. We talked for another 10 minutes about the position requirements, the committee's timeline, and 2 other candidates I'd worked with previously. Walt is a man who does not waste time, which means our conversations are always efficient and always worth having. I hung up and looked at Dennis Colby's name on the whiteboard for a moment. Then I picked up a blue marker and drew a box around it. Megan called that afternoon. She wanted to come stay with me. I told her to think about it for a week first. I wasn't going to be the reason she pulled up from her school and her friends. Mom had a man in our house, Dad. I'm not living with that. I know. So I'm coming Friday. I'll have a room ready. She came Friday. She brought her backpack and her laptop and her attitude, which I mean as a compliment. She walked into the apartment, assessed it with the critical eye of a 17-year-old who has opinions about everything and said, "It's fine. It's better than home right now." "High bar," I said. "Don't push it." She scratched Hank behind the ears for about 30 seconds and then went to find her room. I stood in the kitchen and felt something ease in my chest that I hadn't noticed was tight. I enrolled her in the school near Fort Caldwell the following Monday. Did it in person with her transcript and a notarized custody document Dave had already prepared. The school secretary was efficient and asked no unnecessary questions. I was grateful for competent strangers. Marcus came by the office that week with a six-pack of Yuengling and the news that Carol had called him, apparently looking for leverage or information or both. What did she want? I asked. She wanted me to tell her what you're doing. I told her I was a title company and I didn't know what she was talking about. Thanks. She also said, and I'm quoting here, that you were making things very difficult. Huh? Yeah, I told her I'd pass that along. He handed me a bottle. Consider it passed. Carol called me that same week. I answered, You took Megan. You can't just take her. She came on her own. She's 17. You turned her against me. Carol. She saw a man in her house. You did that. Don't you dare make this about my choices when you've been checked out for years. You've been checked out since before Megan was in middle school. You've been married to that office and those clients, and I have been invisible. I'm hanging up now. Have your attorney call Dave. I hung up. I hadn't raised my voice once. I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment and then set it face down on the desk. The Fort Caldwell Employer Partnership reception was 2 weeks later. I was a registered guest. I'd been on the invitation list for 6 years. I wore my good jacket and drove over and spent the first hour working the room the way I always do, methodically, without rushing, talking to the people I needed to talk to and listening more than I spoke. I was talking to Walt Pruitt and 3 committee members when I saw Carol and Dennis Colby come through the door. They hadn't expected me. That was clear from the half-second of stillness that crossed Carol's face when she spotted me. Dennis recovered faster. He put his hand on Carol's back in that proprietary way men do when they're trying to look confident. But his eyes were scanning the room the way you scan a room when you're trying to figure out how much trouble you're in. I was surrounded by people who knew me, had known me for years. Walt was mid-sentence, and 2 of the committee members were nodding at something I'd said before Carol walked in. This was my room. I had built this room, one placement at a time, over 12 years. Carol watched me work it, and I could see on her face that she was recalculating something. Dennis looked at me across the room. I raised my glass slightly in his direction, a toast. Nothing more. Then I turned back to Walt and finished what I was saying. Dennis went pale. I saw that too. They left early. Dennis had his hand on Carol's back the whole way to the door, but it wasn't affection. It was a man trying to look steady when he wasn't. I turned back to Walt and finished the conversation. When can you have the reference document ready? Walt asked. Thursday, I said. That works. I watched the door swing shut behind Dennis Colby. He didn't know my name yet. He was about to learn it. I spent 2 evenings writing the reference document on Dennis Colby. It was accurate. Every line was sourced. Public records, professional references, documented performance history that I had assembled through 12 years of working the same federal contractor ecosystem Dennis operated in. I did not fabricate. I did not exaggerate. I simply wrote down what was true in the specific language of a professional reference that a hiring committee would know how to read. There were 3 documented instances of budget overruns on federal subcontracts at his previous firm, each attributed to Colby's division in post-project audits. There was a reference from a former colleague who described his management style as results-focused in ways that sometimes created compliance concerns. There was his tenure at a Maryland contractor that had ended, officially for restructuring, but I knew 2 people who'd been there, and restructuring was a generous word for what had happened. None of this was secret. It was just information that required someone to look, and most people don't look. I read the document twice. It was devastating because it was true. I emailed it to Walt Pruitt on Thursday morning with a single cover line. Confidential professional reference, per your request. Walt called Friday afternoon. Ray. Walt. The committee met this morning. Okay. We're going a different direction on the comptroller position. I understand. A pause. Ray. Thank you. That's what I'm here for. Dennis Colby did not get the job. He did not know why. He would spend weeks trying to find out. I was having breakfast at the Harrison County Grill with Marcus On a Tuesday morning in early April, scrambled eggs, black coffee, the usual booth in the back, when Dennis Colby walked in with Gary Lester. Gary Lester sells real estate in Clarksburg. He is the kind of man who knows everything and can't hold any of it. I'd heard through Marcus that Gary had known about the affair for 8 months and told himself it wasn't his business. I didn't hold that against him exactly, but I didn't forget it either. Dennis saw me the moment he came through the door. He stopped walking. Gary bumped into him from behind and said something I couldn't hear. Dennis said something back. Then he walked toward my table. Marcus set his coffee cup down slowly. Dennis stopped at the edge of our table. He had the look of a man who'd been drinking before breakfast, which at 8:30 in the morning is its own kind of statement. You Ray Denton? I am. You killed my job. I looked at him. I provided a professional reference. That's my business. You lied. I didn't. I know it was you. Walt Pruitt's assistant let it slip. You sent a letter full of... Everything in that letter was documented and sourced. If you have a dispute with the content, you're welcome to identify the specific inaccuracy. He leaned on the table. Marcus shifted in his seat. You think this is some kind of game? You think you can come after my career because your wife... I'd stop there, I said. Because your wife finally got tired of being married to a nobody. He didn't finish the sentence because Marcus stood up. Marcus is 6'2" and about 230, and he stood up the way big men stand up, slowly, deliberately, taking up a lot of room. He didn't say anything. He just stood. Dennis looked at him. Then he looked back at me. I hadn't moved. You're going to regret this, Dennis said. Probably not, I said. He left. He knocked a chair on his way out, which I think was accidental, but it made a noise and the whole diner looked up. Gary Lester stood by the door, looking like he wanted to disappear into the wood paneling. Then Gary looked at me and I looked at him and he came over. Ray, I'm sorry, I knew and I should have... Sit down, Gary. He sat. He looked miserable, which was appropriate. Did you know about the Savannah trip? I asked. I drove him to the airport. I nodded. Okay. I'm sorry, Ray. I kept telling myself it wasn't... I know what you told yourself. I picked up my coffee. It's done. I'm not going to make your life difficult. But I want you to know that I know. He nodded. He looked like he might cry, which would have been uncomfortable for everyone, so I changed the subject and asked him how the market was. He answered on autopilot for about 2 minutes and then excused himself and left. Marcus sat back down. You're a scary man, Marcus said. I'm a patient man. There's a difference. Is there? I ate my eggs. The divorce proceedings had been moving through Dave Kowalski's office with the grinding efficiency of West Virginia family law. Carol had hired an attorney named Phyllis Barker, who was competent and aggressive, and had apparently told Carol that she had a strong case. Dave found this mildly amusing. She thinks the marital estate is what she thinks it is, Dave told me. She's going to be surprised. How surprised? Pleasantly surprised would be the wrong word. Let's say educational. The Allegheny Placement Partners. Equity stake was a business asset, not a marital one. I'd structured it that way 4 years ago, before any of this, for entirely legitimate tax reasons. The Edward Jones account, same thing. Carol's attorney had found the Edward Jones account and was making noise about it. But Dave had the documentation to show it predated our marriage by 2 years and had been funded entirely with premarital income. It was clean. It was all clean. What was not clean was Carol's side. The Amex charges constituted marital waste, money spent on the affair from joint funds. Dave had flagged it. Carol's attorney had gone quiet on that point, which meant she'd seen the documentation and understood what it meant. Megan was doing well at the new school. She'd made 2 friends within the first month, which is faster than I would have managed. She came home one afternoon and dropped her backpack and said, Mom called again. What did she say? She wants me to come home. What do you want? I want to stay here. She looked at me. Is that okay? It's more than okay. She picked up her backpack and went to her room. Hank followed her. I stood in the kitchen and felt that thing ease in my chest again. I ran into Patrice Owens at the grocery store in early April. Patrice is the office manager at Mountaineer Benefits Group, Carol's workplace. She is loyal to Carol in the way that people are loyal to whoever makes them feel included, and she had apparently filed false conference paperwork to cover for Carol's Savannah trip. She saw me in the produce section, and her face did three things in about half a second. Ray, she said, and Patrice, I want you to know I didn't know everything. The conference paperwork, I said. She went still. Dave has it, I said. He's not planning to do anything with it unless Carol's attorney makes this difficult, which I'm hoping they won't. I picked up a bag of apples. Have a good afternoon, Patrice. I walked away. I heard her exhale behind me. Dave called me that same week. Carol's attorney has proposed a settlement figure. What is it? He told me. It was lower than I expected, which meant Phyllis Barker had done the math and decided not to fight the business assets. Is it fair? I asked. It's fair. It's not generous to her, but it's fair. Then let's take it. You sure? We could push. I'm sure. I want it done. He filed the paperwork the following Monday. The divorce would be final in 60 days, barring any complications. There were no complications. The divorce came through on a Friday in late May. Dave called me at 9 a.m. to confirm. I thanked him, hung up, and sat at my standing desk for a moment. Then, I went downstairs and knocked on Marcus's door. Done, I said. He nodded. Yuengling's in the fridge. It's 9 in the morning. It's been a long 9 months. I took the Yuengling. Megan was at school. I drove out to the Burnsville Lake Trail after I left the office. Hank ran ahead of me on the gravel path. The water was flat and gray, same as always, and the morning was quiet. I walked for an hour. I thought about the last 9 months. What I'd done, what I hadn't done, what I'd decided at the same water's edge months ago. I thought I'd been fair. I thought I'd been proportionate. I thought the clearance file in the drawer was still in the drawer, which it was, and that I was going to leave it there. I felt okay, not triumphant, just okay, which, honestly, was enough. June Halsey knocked on my door that evening with a bottle of wine and the French press she'd lent me months ago, and apparently wanted back. Heard you had a good day, she said. News travels fast. Small building. She looked at me. You want company or you want to be left alone? Company, I said. Come in. She came in. Hank greeted her with the enthusiasm he reserves for people he's decided are trustworthy, which is a better reference system than most. She sat on the couch and poured 2 glasses of wine and didn't ask me any of the questions I'd been asked by everyone else for 9 months. She asked me what I was working on. I told her about the comptroller search and the 2 other Fort Caldwell placements I had in progress. She told me about a mural commission she'd gotten for a community center in Bridgeport. We talked for 2 hours. When she left, she said, Same time next week? Yeah, I said, and same time. I stood in the doorway and watched her go back to 4B. Hank sat next to me, leaning against my leg. Don't say it, I told him. He wagged his tail. Dennis Colby had been busy making his own problems since the Fort Caldwell job fell through. He'd applied for 2 other positions in the federal contractor corridor. I knew because both hiring managers called me for references, which told me my name was circulating in ways Dennis hadn't anticipated. I gave honest references both times. Both times the committees went a different direction. I heard through the network that Dennis had started making noise about being blacklisted, which is a word people use when they can't account for why their reputation precedes them. I heard he'd had a conversation with Walt Pruitt that had not gone well. I heard he was looking at positions in Maryland and Virginia, which would mean leaving the Morgantown area entirely. None of this was my doing exactly. All of it was the natural consequence of people finding out what he actually was. I also heard, through a channel I hadn't expected, that Dennis's mother was not pleased. Ruth Colby called me on a Thursday afternoon in late May. I recognized the name because she'd been in my network years ago, a retired professional in Morgantown who'd sent me 2 referrals back when I was first building the business. I hadn't spoken to her in 4 years. Mr. Denton, she said, this is Ruth Colby. I believe you know my son. I do, I said. I want you to know that I am aware of what Dennis has done, his behavior with your wife. I am not calling to ask you for anything. I am calling to tell you that I am ashamed of him, and that I think you have conducted yourself with more dignity than he deserves. I didn't know what to say to that for a moment. Mrs. Colby, I said, I appreciate that. I also want you to know, she said, and her voice had a particular edge to it, that I recognized as the specific fury of a mother who built something over 50 years and is watching her son damage it. That I have had a conversation with Dennis about his future behavior. A direct conversation. He will not be a problem for you going forward. I believe you, I said. Good. A pause. I'm sorry for what you've been through, Mr. Denton. Thank you, Mrs. Colby. She hung up. I sat at my desk for a moment. Then I picked up a marker and erased Dennis Colby's name from the whiteboard. The warm June evening arrived, the way June evenings arrive in West Virginia. Slowly, with the last light hanging in the sky longer than you expect, and the air finally losing that edge it's had since October. I was in the driveway of my new house. I should explain the house. 3 weeks after the divorce came through, I'd bought a place in the Fort Caldwell area, a 3-bedroom ranch on a half-acre, backing up to a stand of oaks that Hank had already claimed as his personal territory. It was a good house. Solid. Not flashy. The kind of house you can actually live in. I'd paid for it in cash from the Edward Jones account, which Carol's attorney had spent months trying to get a piece of and had ultimately failed to touch. I was washing the truck in the driveway that evening. Hank was lying in the grass watching me with the philosophical patience of a dog who has decided that human behavior is mostly inexplicable but harmless. The radio was on inside, coming through the screen door. It was a good evening. A car pulled up to the curb. Carol got out. She stood at the end of the driveway and looked at the house. Then she looked at the truck. Then she looked at me. I kept washing the truck. Ray, she said. Carol. She walked up the driveway. She was dressed well, the way she always dressed when she wanted to make an impression, and she looked tired in the way that people look tired when they've been running a version of events in their head that keeps not matching reality. She looked at the house again. This is yours, she said, and it is. You bought a house 3 weeks ago. She stood there. I wrung out the chamois and started on the hood. Dennis left, she said. I didn't say anything. He got a position in Virginia. He said the Morgantown market wasn't working for him anymore. She paused. He didn't ask me to come. Huh? I said. Ray. Carol. I want to... She stopped, started again. I made a mistake. I set the chamois on the hood and looked at her. She looked back at me with the expression of a woman who has rehearsed something and has just realized the room is different than she imagined. I know you made a mistake, and I said. Dave's office has about 400 pages of documentation on the specific nature of it. That's not what I... What do you want, Carol? She looked at the house again. The oak trees. Hank, who had raised his head and was watching her with a mild, disinterested expression. The truck, clean and dark blue in the evening light. I didn't know, she said. I didn't know any of this. The house? All of it. I didn't know what you... She stopped. I thought I was leaving something small. I thought you were pathetic, I said. She flinched. Ray, you said it twice. I remember. She looked at me. Her eyes were wet, which I noted without satisfaction. I had spent 9 months not wanting this moment to feel good, and I was relieved to discover that it mostly didn't. It just felt like the truth arriving late, which is what the truth usually does. I lost everything, she said. You chose everything you lost, I said. That's different. She stood there for a moment. Then she said, Is there any... No, I said. There isn't. She looked at the house one more time. The porch light had come on automatically in the gathering dusk, and through the screen door you could hear the radio and see the warm light from inside, and it probably looked like exactly what it was. A man's home, built from scratch, on his own terms. She turned and walked back to her car. I picked up the chamois and finished the hood. Hank came over and leaned against my leg. I scratched his ears. The last light was going out of the sky, and the oaks were dark against it, and somewhere down the road a neighbor had a grill going, and the smell of it drifted over. I thought about what Carol had said. I didn't know any of this. I didn't know what you... The thing is, she could have known. It was all right there. The accounts, the equity stake, the 43 placements on the whiteboard, the room full of people who knew my name. She just stopped looking 8 years ago and decided she already knew what she was dealing with. I had been the dangerous one the whole time. She just never bothered to check. I wrung out the chamois and hung it over the truck's mirror. The radio was still playing through the screen door. June was coming over at 7. Megan was inside doing homework, and I could hear her moving around in the kitchen, probably making herself something to eat and leaving the cabinet doors open the way she always did, which drove me crazy and which I would not trade for anything. I looked at Carol's taillights disappearing around the corner. Then I went inside.